and also used to run the Ministry of Sound. Now, that's a job I would have liked, I have to say. Annabel Denham is Deputy Comment Editor for the Daily Telegraph. James Schneider is former Labour Party Director of Strategic Communications, while Jeremy Corbyn was its leader, and also co-founder of the campaign group Momentum. Stephen Farry is making his debut on the programme, Deputy Leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland and MP for North Down. You know the number, 0345 6060 973. That's the number to call. Lots of really good questions coming in already. You can text your question to 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And we'd just love it if you'd watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first question. It's David in Enfield. Hello, David.
Good evening, everyone.
Hi.
Today, the United Nations calls for the new migration bill passed last night to be reversed, ensuring that the international human rights for migrants, refugees and asylum seekers are fully respected. Does the panel agree?
Well, in addition to Parliament passing this bill last night, the Bibi Stockholm barge arrived in Portland Harbour in Dorset this morning, and Downing Street says it'll begin housing up to 500 refugees at a time within a fortnight. Let's go to James. I'm told on my screen. Can you hear the question?
No,
right. Let me repeat it, and then we'll get your headphones fixed in a moment. Today, the UN called for the new illegal migration bill passed last night to be reversed, ensuring that the international human rights of all migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are fully respected. Does the panel agree? James Bethell.
Well, I did rebel against aspects of the bill. I voted in favour of safe channels for asylum seekers. And there are some quite gritty elements of this bill, particularly on pregnant women and on people in desperate circumstances, including LGBTQ+, looking for asylum. But overall, we did vote it through in the House of Lords. And the reason is summarised by Ken Clarke, who said that for all of the huff and puff about the bill, no one had come up with a better solution. And that's why eventually it went through, and that's why I voted for it.
Is that really a good reason to pass a bill?
Listen, we've got a global pressure on immigration. It's going to be a generational phenomenon, and no one else has come up with a better way of doing it. I wish they would. I don't like the sight of this big barge full of bedrooms for asylum seekers, but if you can't come up with something alternative, then I'm afraid you get stuck with what's on the agenda.
Annabel Denham.
Well, I think Lord Bethell is certainly right that there aren't very many solutions to what is ultimately a very thorny problem, and there are certainly no realistic, plausible solutions coming from the Labour Party. I don't think any of us sitting here will be wholly comfortable with certain aspects of the illegal migration bill, but ultimately it's very difficult to reconcile various different needs and competing rights. And I think when it comes to the politics of this, that it's absolutely imperative for the Conservative Party to get those numbers down. Let's not forget that we had record numbers of crossings of the Channel in June. It was nearly 4,000 people coming across, and that was just weeks after Rishi Sunak was trying to suggest, standing in Dover, that the numbers were indeed coming down. So, you know, this is a real challenge. I think this is a success in some ways for the government, but in many ways the hard work starts now. How are they going to implement this bill, and does anybody really believe they're going to stop the boats?
Are you comfortable with the fact that the UN has intervened in this?
I think such a thing was inevitable. I mean, you've got mounting pressure from all corners, law firms, charities, various different legal rights groups. Now, the UN, I think it's going to intensify sort of pressure on government to reconsider our membership of the ECHR. It's going to force us to reconsider the involvement of the UN in what are ultimately sovereign decisions. So, no, I'm not wholly comfortable with it, but nor am I comfortable with the current levels of migration and this idea that people are coming into the country illegally and potentially leapfrogging those who are trying to come through legal channels. And I should say that I'm absolutely in favour of refugees coming here and trying to create a better life for themselves, for them economic migrants, or indeed those who are fleeing war-torn countries and have made a very perilous journey to come to Britain. I think that we have a long and proud history of welcoming those sorts of people, but at the same time, 92,000 people on the backlog at the end of last year, something absolutely needs to be done.
I think that's about 170,000 now, isn't it? Something like that. Stephen Farry.
I think this bill is utterly terrible. It's probably one of the worst pieces of legislation that's gone through this Parliament, and there's quite a bit of competition in that regard. I mean, it is a breach of international human rights standards. It is fundamentally anti-refugee. It essentially bans people seeking asylum in the UK outside what are a few deemed safe and legal routes. I mean, the only one that currently exists in any meaningful way is Ukraine. The Afghanistan safe and legal route only really exists on paper. But for example, last year we had about 20 people who came through that route during the entire 12 months.
Hong Kong as well.
And Hong Kong, yeah, obviously Hong Kong as well. But we're creating almost this two-tier situation where we will select a few countries but then close the UK off to the rest of the world. In terms of the overall numbers, I mean, the UK takes relatively less per capita than most other European countries. We're not being invaded. We're not being overwhelmed. This is something as a country we have to get used to over the next few decades. There are 100 million refugees or internally displaced people around the world. Only a small fraction will want to come to the UK for various particular reasons. And it's important that we are welcoming, and we can turn this to our advantage because we have skills gaps in our economy. And often these are people who are coming with existing skills or can be reskilled and fill many of the gaps that exist and the pressure points across a whole range of sectors.
What do you make of James's argument that, well, no one else has come up with any other ideas?
Well, obviously we all want to stop the boats crossing the Channel, but we need to expand the safe and legal routes. That was one of the amendments that the House of Lords was proposing to put in place. So we need to make sure that those safe and legal routes are open and working and exist in practice rather than simply on paper.
James Schneider.
Yeah, it's an absolutely terrible bill, and it doesn't do anything to do with what James just called the generational issue, which it is a generational issue. As Stephen was just saying, there are already 110 million people who are displaced. That's the most there've ever been. The last year was the record. The year before that was the record. It's going up every year. Zurich, the insurance company, no kind of lefty organisation, projects that by mid-century, that's in 25 years' time, there will be 1 billion climate refugees, people moving around the country. That means that we need to have actually serious discussions and agreements in place between countries for how people are going to have fewer push factors being pushed away from the countries where they are, and how they're going to be given safety in other countries. This bill doesn't do that. It doesn't make it any easier. In fact, it makes it harder to come up with international agreements, exactly as the UN Human Rights Commissioner said.
Why does it do that? How does it do that?
Because the UK is breaching its international obligations, which would then encourage other countries to do the same. It's a race away from some kind of collective agreement. What you need to actually see is an agreement between as many countries as possible to set up secure routes, to have quotas of people who are going to different countries with secure rights. The reason why people are taking these terrifying illegal routes into Europe as well as the UK, I mean, the Mediterranean is a mass grave, as is the Sahara, of people who are fleeing from agriculture breaking down because of climate change or from conflict. This is a generational problem, as James Bethell said, and this bill sets us backwards. Not only is it inhumane and unpleasant and all the rest of it, if you're actually serious about dealing with the issue of forced movement of people, which is going to be a very, very, very big issue for years to come, this takes us right backwards.
But in terms of what's happening now, the Labour Party doesn't seem to have come up with any alternatives to what the government's doing. They just say, oh, well, it's all terrible. And whenever I interview a Labour shadow minister and we're talking about this subject, I say, yeah, but what's your alternative? And all they can say is safe routes, which is, I mean, fine, but that doesn't actually solve the immediate issue.
Yeah, so, I mean, Labour don't put forward very many solutions about very many things. That's sort of the new House policy. But there are things that you could do and that could be brought forward. So, firstly, you can deal with the push reasons. So, in the Sahel in Africa, in Central America, and in parts of the Indian subcontinent, where you're seeing the largest amount of forced migration from climate change. That's where there needs to be the largest amount of investment in food systems and in water. That helps to reduce the push. In terms of international agreements that need to be struck, that means, in this case, European countries, including Britain, getting together and coming up with some kind of humane and workable solution. This takes you away from that. And of course, saying safe and legal routes, exactly as Stephen was saying, there aren't any safe and legal routes. If you are fleeing persecution in almost every country in the world, there is no safe way to come to Britain. That is not the country that I think that we are. That is not the kind of decent, welcoming people. You can say platitudes and say, oh, well, we should be helping people. But if you have policies that prevent people from having coming in a safe way. So actually, there should be an agreement between the relevant countries that in the main transit hubs, so in Libya and in other places, that is open as a safe route for a certain number of people who can apply there, rather than risking their lives. And we saw just the other week 700 people drowned in the Mediterranean trying to get to Greece.
But surely, if you are in a war zone and you're looking to, or for whatever reason, you feel you need to leave your own country, you may be being persecuted, family may have been tortured, whatever the reason is, surely the main thing is to go to the nearest safe country. And then, for maybe under the auspices of the United Nations, I don't know, for all the other countries of the world to say, OK, well, in any given year, we're going to take X number.
That's what I'm saying. That would be a transit hub.
Fine.
That's precisely what I'm saying.
But at the moment, people are being drawn to come to this country through these unsafe routes across the Channel. And it seems as though nobody's got any ideas of how to stop that. Because if they had, they would have been implemented by now.
Well, firstly, I don't think the government is particularly interested in actually dealing with the problem, because being able to say stop...
Why would you say that?
I think being able to say stop the boats is quite useful for them politically. And
not if they can't actually stop them, because then that's a policy failure.
You've only got them and the Labour Party, and it's who do you trust more to be tough on stopping the boats. You saw the same thing in Australian politics 10, 15 years ago. But leaving the more Machiavellian elements of it to the side, you could have an agreement with France doing that very thing in Calais, which reduces the reason for people to take the unsafe journey. And on the sort of canard that people should stop moving when they get to a particular country. If people are risking their lives and all the money probably that they have in order to do something, it's because they don't feel safe where they are, and they will feel safe here.
So, James, your government doesn't actually want to solve this because it's quite useful to have a slogan, stop the boats.
No, I don't believe the Machiavellian stuff. If you sit with voters, they express a real dilemma about this. On the one hand, there's a question of fairness. What people don't like is the sight of anyone jumping the queue and using some kind of underhand manner, for instance, taking a boat across the Channel, in order to take an advantage over everyone else. On the other hand, people know that immigration is very important for the economy. They like the people who they work with, and they like the values of Britain being an open and welcoming country. And it is that clash of feelings of fairness versus feelings of generosity that I think has made this issue particularly toxic.
The problem is there is no queue, and the tiny queue that there was for countries not Ukraine and not Hong Kong by this bill has been closed. So you can't say, the problem is it's not really fair because we would actually want to help these other people and we're going to be helping you instead of these other people. There isn't a safe legal route to come into this country from any country other than Ukraine and from Hong Kong. So there isn't a queue that people are jumping.
Jay, we've got more immigration this year than ever before.
We're talking about asylum seekers. We're talking about people claiming asylum.
I know. No, you're talking about that. I'm talking about Britain's generosity to welcome people who want to make a future for themselves in the UK in the round. it isn't only about asylum seekers. It is also about Britain presenting itself to the world as somewhere where people can make a future for themselves.
So why the focus on stop the boats? Where in terms of numbers, the numbers that are crossing across the Channel compared to the overall number of migrants coming in is a tiny proportion.
Correct.
So why the fixation on this?
It's 45,000. That's not a tiny proportion.
When net migration is hundreds and hundreds of thousands, that is a small proportion.
It's 45,000 coming across the Channel out of a total net migration of 600,000. It's a minority, but it's not a tiny proportion.
Okay, between 5 and 10%. Fine. That's quite a small proportion of the numbers. So if we're talking about the queue and jumping ahead of the queue as if that there are these ways in that people can come safely and legally, which there aren't, and then trying to muddy the waters between. We
could talk about this subject for the rest of the hour, but we're not going to because there's lots and lots of questions coming in. But if you'd like to add to them, 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
If you've just tuned in, James Bethell is with us, Conservative peer, Annabel Denham from the Telegraph, James Schneider, formerly of Momentum. What are you doing now? I know you've written a book.
I've written a book. I'm writing another book.
You're writing another one?
I do the communications for the Progressive International, which is a global alliance of political parties, trade unions, social movements and campaigns.
And Stephen Farry is here, Deputy Leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland and MP for North Down. Just the Alliance Party, I think, is fascinating because I think it is fair to say it's on the up, and it's not nationalist, it's not unionist.
Yep.
It's a bit like the Liberal Democrats, sort of halfway in between.
Well, they are our sister party in Great Britain, but in Northern Ireland we make a very deliberate choice not to define ourselves around the constitutional question. So we are a cross-community party, and we try to draw voters from all the different traditions, and there are a lot of people who are moving away from traditional labels and voting alliance. So we have grown quite dramatically over the past 3 or 4 years, and are now the third largest party in Northern Ireland.
But that might be a problem in future, might it not? When there are new elections, which we think could happen this year, who knows? If you came second or first, you couldn't, under the Good Friday Agreement, you couldn't nominate a First Minister or a deputy, could you? Because you have to have one tradition in each post.
Yeah, whenever the agreement was written back in 1998, and probably something similar with the Dayton Agreement in Bosnia, there was a working assumption that there would forever be the traditional divide that would be locked in, and you base your power sharing around that. But demographics often change, and the system has to be flexible enough to accommodate that. So we would recommend reform of the institutions to allow for what we term a voluntary coalition. So parties with a weighted majority between them could form an executive.
And what do the other parties think of that? Because in the end, it would have to be presumably legislated for.
It would, and there's mixed views on that. Obviously, those parties that benefit from the current rules will be most resistant to that. But of course, Ian, at this stage, there is no functioning executive and assembly in Northern Ireland. We've had a standoff for the past 18 months, and over the past 25 years, indeed, the institutions have been down for 40% of that time. So there's inbuilt instability in the system. So reform is key to breaking those deadlocks.
So when Brandon Lewis, the former Northern Ireland Secretary, suggested that the Good Friday Agreement is out of date and should be updated, you would probably agree with him.
Well, the agreement is sound in terms of the basic principles, but it has to evolve with time, and a review was built into the structures of the agreement itself. So it was understood, even people like George Mitchell, who chaired the talks, always understood that it would evolve over time, and 25 years on, we've seen a lot of change.
Right, let's go to another question. It's a text question from Will in Crediton. The recent case regarding a woman who illegally obtained an abortion seems to have reopened the debate over abortion term limits. Is it right that we reopen this debate, and is there a risk the right to an abortion is undermined by medical advancements? Now, we talked about this in the last hour. The jail sentence given to Carla Foster for illegally obtaining abortion pills during lockdown was reduced to a suspended sentence by the Court of Appeal today. Now, of course, this is a big issue in Northern Irish politics as well, isn't it, Stephen?
This is a fascinating issue for us in Northern Ireland, because if you go back to 1967, whenever the Abortion Act was introduced into Great Britain, of course, that didn't, strictly speaking, decriminalise abortion. Northern Ireland was excluded, and we were governed by the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, and so abortion was...
Which is what this case was under.
Yes, so in effect, that was the residual law, and in effect, abortion was effectively illegal in Northern Ireland, though some medical abortions did take place under some very sort of closely defined circumstances. In 2019, as part of some of the legislation that was passed through Westminster, abortion was effectively decriminalised in Northern Ireland. So we have now, in Northern Ireland, being perhaps viewed as the most socially conservative part of the UK, have now jumped ahead of the rest of the UK. So we're now decriminalised, whereas the UK is still strictly speaking criminal based on the 1861 Act, but with the provision of the 67 Act allowing abortion to take place in most practical circumstances. So I do believe, especially for based around what are international human rights standards, particularly the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that UK law or GB law is now out of date and does need to be updated.
What about the issue of term limits? Because if there was to be a new abortion bill going through Parliament, there would be arguments on term limits. Now, the term limit at the moment is 24 weeks. Would you? Is that reasonable, or do you think that should be changed?
Well, I think it's difficult for legislators to walk in the shoes of every woman who has to make a very sometimes difficult choice. And often, whenever you're talking about late-term abortions, those are in the most tragic cases. So we need to be very careful about putting in place strict limits that don't take full account of what may well be some very unusual circumstances where we need to show compassion to someone who's in that situation. So I would urge flexibility. And as much as I'm critical of the current Parliament, and there is a small social conservative tendency, but by and large across most of the political parties there is a broad liberal consensus around women's right to choose, which is welcome.
Annabel.
I think that this debate can seem so polarised between those who are pro-choice on the one hand and those who are pro-life on the other. And of course, it's a lot more nuanced, and there's a very sensible middle ground that can be found. Now, the last time that we reviewed the term limit was back in 1990, when it was reduced from 28 to 24 weeks. And I think that we are about due another review now, in view of the fact that medicine has advanced and there are some fetuses which can survive outside of the womb from, I think, about 22 or 23 weeks. And I think that that is a sensible reasonable cut-off point. If the fetus is able to survive and have a decent quality of life after a certain point, then that is surely the point that you stop women from being able to terminate their pregnancies. But the case of Carla Foster was absolutely horrendous. I mean, what that woman must have gone through is terrible, but there are also those who, of course, are going to point out, what her unborn baby had gone through and who was advocating for it. However, I don't think that a jail sentence was necessary. I think the jail sentence was all about punishment and retribution, and that actually there are other better ways of dealing with this than throwing somebody into jail, somebody who is presumably very vulnerable, perhaps mentally not especially well, and I think that was a neglect of the duty that we all had to that woman. So it sounds like the right decision has now been made, and like I said, I think it's about time that we reviewed those limits.
Now, James Bethell, you were Health Minister. You were telling me before that it was actually you that brought in this ability during COVID to get pills to do abortions by post. Now, when you look at this case of Carla Foster, do you regret having done that?
No, I don't regret it. During the pandemic, clearly you couldn't go and see your GP, so we had to bring about a new system where people could get pills without seeing their GP. The subsequent debate about whether to retain that system did pivot a lot about that therapeutic component. Should people have to see face-to-face a clinician before getting the second pill? And there was a lot of discussion about coercion and about mental health. And that's what strikes me about this case. There was someone here who wasn't very well, as Annabel put very compassionately, I thought, and who maybe under different circumstances could have been treated in a different way by a GP. Overall, the system has worked. There are hundreds of thousands of people who have gone down this route now without a problem. But we did envisage that there would be exceptions, that there would be trouble like this. And it breaks my heart to read this story.
What about the question from Will? Do you think that the abortion laws that Stephen suggests should be updated? And if so, what should the main term limit be?
Well, I think that if you're going to unpack the settlement, and it was a hard-fought settlement back in the day, then you're going to have to look at lots of different components, including the term limit, including the therapeutic element, including other types of clinical accountability. Is the country ready to do that? I don't get that sense right now. But Stephen is right. Science has changed and babies are surviving at a much earlier stage than they used to be. We leave it to the clinicians to use their discretion, not the law. I'm personally comfortable with that, but I agree that there is a question mark over this area.
James?
Yeah, I agree with James that I'm comfortable with where things are now, but I think if there is going to be a new law passed, and I can see the argument for updating a law from 1861 that has sent someone to prison when it seems like they really shouldn't have been sent to prison based on the details of their case, then if the debate is taking place in the sort of way that everybody here has spoken about, then we could do it fine. I think it depends on whether people are having this kind of calm, humane, compassionate discussion about something rather than, trying to go to war over it.
Great answers from all of you on this. Thank you very much indeed. We'll come to more of your questions in just a moment. But first, at 8:30, let's get the LBC News headlines from Charlotte Morgan.
A judge says a woman jailed for having an illegal abortion during lockdown should be treated with compassion. 45-year-old Carla Foster will be released after winning an appeal against her sentence. Downing Street says a barge which is docked in Dorset will start housing asylum seekers within the next fortnight. There were protests when the Bibby Stockholm arrived today, a month later than expected. And it's been confirmed there'll be no service at all on the London Underground during 2 of next week's strike days. The tube won't run Wednesday the 26th or Friday the 28th of July, with little to no service on the Tuesday and Thursday. LBC weather, rain will clear over southern Scotland and central and northern England tonight, dry elsewhere with a low of 6.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:32, let me reintroduce my panel to you. We have Amanda Denham, Deputy Comment Editor of the Daily Telegraph. She commissions me sometimes. This is all very incestuous. James Schneider, former Labour Party Director of Strategic Communications, and he's the author of a book called Our Block, 30-second elevator pitch. I know you've done it before.
Thanks very much. It's a plan for the post-Corbyn left for how we can win in the 2020s. And my argument is that we shouldn't be arguing about whether we should be in the Labour Party or not, but instead bring together trade unions, social movements and the left in politics into a bloc.
And if you want to listen to James talking about that for a whole hour, you can do so on my late lamented Iain Dale Book Club podcast. Stephen Farry is Deputy Leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland and MP for North Down. Was that Enoch Powell's constituency?
Well, he was South Down.
South Down. How could I make that mistake? And James Bethell, former owner of the Ministry of Sound nightclub. Now that I bet you've got a few stories from that.
I have, Ian. I'm not sure if I can share them all with you.
Okay, maybe you're fair. Right, let's go to Stephen in East Grinstead for our next question. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, good evening to you, Ian, and your guests. On Thursday, will the Prime Minister be handing out P45s to the three Conservative Party candidates standing in the by-elections being held?
That's a very interesting question. I want predictions from you all on who's going to win what on Thursday. So we've got Somerton and Frome, we've got Uxbridge and South Ruislip, and Selby and Ainsty. Let's go to Stephen first.
2 Labour and 1 Liberal Democrat, so it'll be 3 Conservatives will lose their seats. It's a time for people to give the government a good kicking. They're down in the polls. They're unpopular. They're struggling. They're losing direction. So it's a protest by-election season and probably a sign of what's to come in the general election as well.
James.
Yeah, same prediction. I don't think it's looking good for the Tories.
Do you not think in the Uxbridge one that the ULEZ issue might save the Tories, or do you not think they've made a big enough issue of that there?
Well, I think they've made a big issue of it, but the ground that they had to catch up, I think, at least if you look at the polls, was so much that I think they're going to be struggling.
Lord Ashcroft did a poll when Boris Johnson was still the MP, before we knew there was going to be a by-election. And it said that if he had been the candidate there, he would have won it. Now, who knows? But I thought that was quite interesting. And it was literally about 3 days before Boris Johnson resigned, which was great timing. James?
The tough thing for Tories is that you've got the yellow wall in the southwest, you've got the blue wall crumbling in the southeast, and you've got Labour hitting the red wall in Selby. It really is a three-way crunch that crystallises all the worst nightmares of the Tories all on one night. And there's going to be a lot of people, I think, in Tory HQ with their heads in their hands.
So you agree with your colleagues there that there's going to be 3 losses?
It's going to be 3 losses, but not just any old losses. They're going to each characterise the pressure that the Tory vote is under from these 3 different directions.
And what might the consequences of that be?
Well, we've already seen 50 Tory MPs declare that they're standing down. I think there'll be quite a few more, because Westminster's a really tough place to be an MP right now, and I think quite a few will feel that they've had their time and want to move on.
Because often in these circumstances, the leader comes under pressure. Rishi Sunak has only been there for 8 months, but could that happen?
I don't feel that. I think that that mumbling and that feeling that we need to change our leader, with every season has passed. He's clearly working incredibly hard. The guy's got a huge amount of integrity. He's got the best intentions of the nation and of the party. And so I think there's a lot of credibility there. He may try to shuffle the pack a bit with a cabinet move around at the weekend. That
always works, doesn't it?
I'm not a big. That's right. I'm not a big fan of that.
It means more articles in the Daily Telegraph for me, though.
I know. So, and he's not that kind of cynical player. You'd think he's a spreadsheet kind of organiser. So you'd think he'd want to have a really well organised plan in advance.
Bonus question for you from me: would you care to predict which of the Tory London mayoral candidates will get the nod when the result is announced tomorrow morning? Susan Hall or Moz Hussain?
I think Susan is the standout player, if there is such a thing in that collection.
That's diplomatic, sort of. Well, anybody that wants to see the two, we did do a hustings debate on this show last week, and shall we say it was quite an experience. Annabel?
I'm going to resoundingly agree with the rest of the panel. I think it's going to be an extremely painful night for the Conservative Party. I'm afraid, much as I would have liked to have seen the Tories turn Uxbridge into a referendum on ULEZ, the expansion of which I think is very undemocratic and regressive and should be reconsidered. It's interesting that Lord Ashcroft polling in, I wasn't aware of it, because there are grumblings and complaints from some quarters that the reason why the by-election will be so bad for the Conservatives is Long Boris, something called Long Boris. That's
this is
being
not
played,
something I wish to visualise.
That's being played out, but I think it's quite telling of the desperation within the party, that the idea that they might hold on to one seat. Let's not forget that 2 of those seats have roughly a 20,000 Conservative majority, but that just holding one of the 3 would be greeted with heavy relief by the party. So it's bad news.
Well, I predicted that each party is going to win one of them in my column for you yesterday, which I'm now slightly thinking, not so sure now. I think the Liberal Democrats will win Somerton Froome, but the Selby and Ainsty one I think is quite difficult to call, because I think people in London think, oh, well, it's a northern seat, so therefore Labour are going to win it. It's a 21,000 majority. Now, that's not to say that the Conservatives haven't lost those kind of majorities, but to the Liberal Democrats in the past. And I just have this feeling that the Tories might hang on to that, but you all disagree with me. But there we go. Right, let's go to a text question. Stephen, thank you. Let's go to a text question from Gordon. What is the point of a Labour Party which follows Tory spending policy? James Schneider.
It's a very good question, to which there isn't really an answer other than not very much. I mean, the Labour Party is meant to be for the many, not the few. And it spends its whole time saying the Tories shouldn't be in power because they have the wrong priorities and they make the wrong choices. And then you go ahead and make exactly the same ones and lock yourself into the same ones. And you're meant to be trying to do something different, because you're meant to be a different party with a different social base and different priorities and different values. So you can do so. But also, we are facing massive interlocking crises in this country and around the world for the next decade and more. And the current policies that the government have fall woefully short of doing anything about them. I'm talking about cost of living crisis, climate breakdown. We were talking about migration and refugees earlier. And Labour should be putting up an alternative, because under our electoral system, you've got 2 choices. It's either going to be the Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister or Rishi Sunak will be Prime Minister. And voters deserve a choice. And at the moment, they're not being given one.
The Shadow Culture Secretary, Lucy Powell, said this morning, and this is kind of an echo of 2010, there is no money left, and that's why Labour cannot make spending commitments. But if they can't change the policy on the two-child benefit cap,
what can they do?
You wonder what on earth the Labour Party is for, don't you?
And yeah, it's baffling. And I like Lucy Powell, and I like to think that she doesn't really think that, and doesn't really think that this is going to be a second-term priority to take 250,000 children out of poverty in one stroke. And this idea that there's no money left, it depends who you're taxing and who you aren't taxing. Rishi Sunak pays a lower rate of tax than all of us sitting in this studio, because most of his income comes in capital gains tax and dividends tax. Under Thatcher in the 80s, that was the same level as income tax. So if you were to equalise those things, which is what we had in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister and Nigel Lawson was the Chancellor, then that would bring in £15 billion a year. So the idea that there isn't any money is completely for the birds. It's because the party's too scared to take on the powerful forces in the country, to take on big business and accumulated wealth, which is there and which could easily be taxed. It's not paying its fair share. And if you did do that, you could tax the few to provide universal benefits that the many would benefit from, and we'd have a happier and healthier society for it.
Stephen?
Well, I think Keir Starmer's trying to play this incredibly safe, not to make any mistakes, and almost win by default on the basis that the Conservatives are so so unpopular that Labour become the natural alternative. I think there are potentially some dangers in that from being complacent, because I think I tend to agree with James. People will want to see a genuine alternative put in place for voters, and indeed to have the ability to fulfil a mandate after the next election. You do need to be open and transparent whenever you go to the polls to have that credibility to carry it through a parliament, especially if it is a hung parliament or divided parliament in some way, or there is potential for rebellions. Also, there is an issue about swing voters. There's also an issue about mobilising your own base, and if you're not able to encourage them to come to the polls with something that suggests a different way forward for the country, people may actually end up staying at home. And the lessons of '92 live long in the memory, I suppose, but you can also play that both ways. You have to reach out and mobilise people.
Annabel.
I think it's certainly right that Labour are trying to avoid a repeat of John Smith's budget of 1992, which really turned out to put off voters. But equally, there are risks from Keir Starmer trying to say nothing at all on anything at all, as we're now seeing be played out. But, you know, I'm relieved as a free marketeer who's in favour of a smaller state and lower taxes to hear that the Labour Party would stick to the current spending plans of the Conservative government were they to come into power. And of course, that's what we saw in 1997, although in 97 it was accompanied by this beginning of a regulatory ratchet. You know, we are at or close to our taxable limit. We're set to have the highest tax burden in 7 decades later this decade. So, you know, it's absolutely not the case that we can try and squeeze the rich more and that somehow that money will trickle down to the poorest in society. All we will see is massive capital and talent flight. The difference now compared with the 1980s is that we live in a globalised economy. It's very easy for the super wealthy to move from one jurisdiction to the next, to move somewhere where they can live and work in a more favourable tax regime. So frankly, that idea is just for the birds, and we can't borrow anymore. That much has been proven by the Liz Truss debacle and the current debt repayments and the interest on our current national debt, which keeps going up anyway. So no, I think there's very little wiggle room for the Labour Party when they come into power. I think they're right to prioritise fiscal rectitude, but whether we actually see them commit to that and stick to that when they come into power, if they come into power, well, I think that remains to be seen.
OK, James.
Well, Annabelle's put it incredibly well. What this is pointing to is the problem they have about personality. Labour is doing the right thing by emoting a sense of responsibility. Everyone knows there's not much money, and therefore anyone who claimed that they could somehow invent a load of money to spend in the short term is going to create a very bad political reaction. Where Keir Starmer is really struggling as a result is projecting his own sense of character and his own engagement with the British voter. And I think that's totally flatlining. He has not sealed the deal with the voter. And I think Labour needs to work really hard to think of some creative ways to try and bring out his personality. Otherwise, they're going to have a bit of a dodo candidate.
Do you remember Points of View on the BBC where Barry Took would present a sort of 20-minute programme about how awful or how brilliant the BBC was, and people would write in saying, I would happily pay £500 for my licence fee. Well, I've got a similar one here from Josh, who says, panel, would you all agree that Iain is one of the best broadcasters on LBC? Although I don't always agree with his views, but I personally think he's amazing and exciting.
We should put that on the wall.
It's the exciting bit that I was most surprised by, but there we are.
Is that your brother?
Corey says, Josh, you're banned, I'm afraid. I won't bother going around the table for fear of what they might say. It's 8:46.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Thank you. James Bethell, Annabel Denham, James Schneider and Stephen Parry with us. Sorry, Farry. Do you get that a lot?
Sometimes, it's fine.
Apologies. With us, answering your questions on Cross Question. Right, let's go to Kevin in Basingstoke. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
Should we be alarmed that private healthcare companies have donated £800,000 to the Conservative Party?
Over what period of time?
Ooh, don't know. You got me there.
Well, I mean, the point of the point of asking that question is, if it was £800,000 in a single year, or £800,000 over the last 20 years. I mean, there's a bit of a difference there in terms of
last year.
Last year, okay. Well, Open Democracy has revealed that more than 35 private health and social care businesses have collectively donated £800,000 to the Conservatives. James Bethell, you know I'm coming to you first.
Of course. I don't recognise that number at all. Of course, you have to have a person behind the donation, so I don't understand how companies have done that. But listen, the commitment that the Tory...
It's apparently in the last 10 years, I'm told.
Right. So it's not such a lot of money. Nonetheless, listen, we should be asking the question, is there undue influence from private business in policy making? I think over the last 10 years, the Tory party has shown a phenomenal commitment to the NHS. Certainly during my time as a minister, we were absolutely all in for supporting the principle of free access at the point of delivery and of trying to invest a huge amount in both the capital and workforce of the NHS. We've never spent more on public health than we are doing right at the moment. And in terms of the values and the institution, this party is all in when it comes to public health.
For people not watching us on Global Play, you've got very defensive body language.
I know.
Folding your arms in front of you. But, I mean, look, when you were... let's talk Turkey. When you were a minister, did you ever have party donors sort of contact you, basically wanting you to do what they wanted you to do?
What I had a lot was a partnership with private industry in the round. So a huge amount of healthcare is provided by pharma companies, by GPs, by hospital groups, by technologists, by data. The whole of the healthcare system of the UK involves private business, and that is not something we should be ashamed of. They are the people who are innovating, who are taking risks, who are putting their capital to play. The idea that this is some kind of charitable effort or publicly owned enterprise is just not right, and we should be honest with voters and with listeners on that point.
But you haven't answered my question.
Have I ever met a donor? Yes, of course, Ian, I have done. Have they ever sought to put undue influence on policy making and decision making? No, they haven't.
PPE?
No, on PPE we put a public appeal out to the whole country. We couldn't have been more emphatic, and we took calls from absolutely everyone, from Labour donors, from Tory donors, from members of Parliament, from all parties, from anyone who could take the... I got a call one day from someone who said, I make plastic chairs for garden furniture, but I'm prepared to give ventilators a go. Will you help me? So that was
I said that was...
I said, give it a go, mate, because that was our attitude in the middle of the pandemic. And it's being characterised as being something that was either corrupt or inappropriate. I don't agree. I think it was a national coming together to try to help the country in a desperate time.
James Schneider.
Out of which some Tory donors made fabulously large amounts of money. So whether it happens in a conversation or it doesn't have to function that way, one of the best investments that you could have made with your capital in recent years is to donate money to the Conservative Party and then later win COVID contracts.
But those contracts are presumably, and correct me if I'm wrong here, James, the procedure for awarding those contracts goes through, say, the Department of Health. Ministers can't direct civil servants to say you've got to award this contract to that company because they're a donor to the Conservative Party, or indeed for any reason.
Sure, but as we saw with the Greensill thing, there's Jeremy Hayward saying, I used to work with this guy at the bank. I can't believe we're leaving money on the table like this. I mean, it doesn't have to work in ways that aren't insidious. It doesn't have to be so point blank. A minister walks in the office and says, right, we know we're doing this here. And I think, you might not have thought that there were any inappropriate conversations that took place, but to the outside world, it looks very dodgy when people give money to the Conservative Party, and then their companies, which have no record of delivering these services, are then including like a family office in Mauritius, for example, get given these things. And it isn't just the Tories. If you want to come back, people who are linked to private healthcare have also given money to Wes Streeting and Labour's front bench. And there is a revolving door between government and private healthcare because there is money in it. Alan Milburn, who was Health Secretary under New Labour, then went to work in private healthcare. Likewise, Patricia Hewitt. So we see these things happening. It's a problem with our entire political system that there can be too much influence bought with donors. And the only thing that we're lucky about is that there's hugely less money in British politics than there is in US politics, where it is even more bought and sold.
And it's transparent because if anybody makes a donation, is it over £5,000 to a political party?
500.
It's 500. It has to be registered. You want to come back, James, quickly?
Well, what I don't like about James's approach there is that he's smearing the officials who work very hard and with great integrity to make these decisions, as you pointed out, Ian. What James is implying is that the whole system is corrupt and that the professional civil servants who allocate these procurement decisions are themselves involved in some kind of conspiracy to award contracts to politicians' favourite business people. That is simply not fair. He's also expressing a naivety about actually how anything is delivered in this country. Of course things are delivered by the private sector. That's what Britain depends upon for the delivery of a lot of public services. So the idea that we don't talk to companies is frankly deluded and shows a complete naivety about the way in which policies actually delivered.
But the way in which policies were actually delivered at the time, and you can argue that this happened because things had to happen very fast as COVID, you've got to throw the rules out the window, but the way in which...
No one threw the rules out the window.
But the way in which the contracts were awarded were found by our own courts to be illegal.
No.
Yes, when Matt Hancock was Health Secretary, the way in which COVID contracts were was found to be illegal. So it's not like there was this fantastic process.
The publication of contract announcements was found to be illegal. The award of the contracts themselves was found to be absolutely fine.
Right. So I don't think you can pretend that there's this perfect neutral process. And it just so happens that it was the most wonderful investment for people to give money to the Conservative Party 1 year, and in the following year they have huge amounts of money. I'm not suggesting.
I'll tell you one thing that did happen.
I'm not suggesting
is that we did have a global crisis, and unusual people came forward with solutions. Maverick, wild, entrepreneurial people.
I can remember. I texted Matt Hancock because I had 2 or 3 people ring into this programme saying, look, I can do this. I don't know what to do. How do I do it? And I thought, well, I don't know. So I texted Matt Hancock. I think he actually passed one of them to you, and you emailed me for more details. Now, in a way you could accuse, because I had access to Matt Hancock and you, I mean, you could say that was a bit dodgy, but I thought I was doing my patriotic duty.
We were very short.
You were, and I don't think you were. But just to go back to Kevin's question, should we be worried when interests that have a particular interest in policy going a certain way are giving money to politicians? The answer is yes,
right,
whether it's higher healthcare or anything else.
We haven't heard from Annabel and Stephen yet. Annabel.
I think that various stings and scandals recently certainly suggest that the issue of lobbying probably does need to be reviewed. When it comes to PPE procurement during the pandemic, I think it's all very well saying these things with the gift of hindsight. But, and the point has been made, it was a global crisis. We weren't sufficiently prepared. Part of the reason why we weren't sufficiently prepared was a failing on the part of Public Health England, which was supposed to be focused on the prevention of infectious diseases, but instead indulged in various nanny state projects like food reformulation and trying to push through things like a sugar tax. And I'm sorry, James, but I just despair when I hear Conservative politicians talk about increasing investment going into the NHS, because what are we getting for it? It's all very well saying that it's free at the point of entry, but at what cost? When, there was a recent study from the King's Fund which found that on a number of metrics of 19 developed countries, we were second worst when it came to outcomes. Efficiency is very poor within the NHS. If you cannot cannot get access to treatment, then what is the point of it being free? And we saw that very recently with the Alzheimer's drug, which is a massive medical breakthrough. And then you contrast that to our creaking, socialist, centrally planned healthcare system, which isn't going to be able to scan people. We haven't got enough PET scanners to scan people to get the early diagnosis in order to administer these drugs. It's absolutely tragic.
Stephen.
Well, obviously there is a role for the private sector in the healthcare system, but I think the fear that people have is the emergence of a two-tier system where those who have access to resources can get a better quality of healthcare, and others are in the notional free at the point of entry health system, but don't actually get good outcomes. And for us in Northern Ireland, we have some of the longest waiting lists in the UK. For some elective surgery, you're talking 5-6 years, which are utterly shocking. So you think it's bad Great Britain come to Northern Ireland?
Well, I wish we'd gone to this question a bit earlier, actually, because we could have had a much longer debate on it. But let's finish off with our fun question with Michael in Halesowen, who says, an original Apple iPhone from 2007 has gone for $190,000 at an auction in America. What bit of tech have you clung on to for far too long? Annabel.
I hung on to my brother's Game Boy. I'm not sure he actually knows this, and I have a Tetris game that goes in it. And I was absolutely delighted just a few weeks ago because it turned out that my husband was never allowed to have any computer games when he was a child, and he never had a Game Boy.
They never existed when I was a child.
Oh, well. He desperately wanted one as a kid, and he was never allowed to have one. And so now I must go into the attic, my parents' attic, and try and dig it out.
Stephen.
Well, on the theme of phones, I actually came across my old BlackBerry, which was standard issue for politicians.
Friend for life. I miss my BlackBerry.
10, 15 years ago. I'm now actually tempted to get it valued in terms of what's actually happened. The other thing I think I have somewhere, but I can't quite find it, but I'm sure I definitely didn't throw it out, is my old ZX Spectrum from 1982.
Oh, wow.
Where you plugged it into your TV, rubber keyboard.
James.
I kept all my phones from the very beginning. And I reached into the drawer to have a look at them, and I'd found my wife had given them to charity, to an African charity, and there was a real conflict because I was obviously very proud of her philanthropic effort, but I was secretly quite furious that she'd given it all away.
Secretly furious, I'll bet. James.
I wish I had a story as good as those. I used to be a journalist. I kept my dictaphone for far too long. I got a digital one. I was very excited about it, and then I kept on using that for far too long when it was much better to just use your phone and, WhatsApp across the stuff.
I was going to make a very inappropriate joke then, but kept it to myself for once. Thank you very much indeed to Annabel Denham, to James Bethell, to James Schneider and Stephen Farry. Now, coming up in the next hour, we are going to talk about vaping because Rishi Sunak has said that, well, he's indicated that he wants to launch a crackdown on youth vaping as pressure grows for a ban on disposable devices. I think this is becoming a major problem. We talked about it before on the programme, and some people say, well, it's great that teenage smoking is at the lowest level for decades, but what are the dangers of vaping, and does it need more regulation? Do we need to ban some of these disposable devices? 0345 606